And I'd like to now turn the floor over to Frediano for the first 7 minutes of commentary on our topic. Frediano,
thank you, Stefan, for your introduction. Thank you, Ambassador Minuto Rizzo, for your invitation. As you said, I'm a journalist. I'm not an analyst or an academic. And at the top of all, I'm here personally, not on behalf of my TV. So the Italian COVID lockdown was the first lockdown in a big Western democratic country, a founding member of the European Union, and as you know very well, a member of NATO. The lockdown started, you can see in the first slide, on March the 9th until May the 18th. 70 long days. And in that 70 long days, Italy was headline in newspaper and newscasts all over the world. These are the four pictures, in my opinion, that will stay in the future in our minds and probably in the books of history. Picture number one, you can see a very impressive picture, a column of Italian military trucks carrying dozens of coffins in the northern city of Bergamo. Picture number two, people singing from balcony all over Italy every day at 6 o'clock sharp. Picture number three, a dramatic picture, the special plastic helmet doctors call it chip, used to provide oxygen to people in intensive care unit. And the last picture, number four, an exhausted nurse after a night of overwork in the hospital of Cremona in Lombardy. The name of this nurse is Elena, and she's been awarded a Goldsmith by the Italian president Sergio Mattarella. So these are the pictures, in my opinion, symbol of the Italian lockdown. But for our discussion today, there are more interesting pictures that show how foreign countries decided to help Italy, my country, with hidden goals and sometimes different ambitions. So we have this slide. After a controversial phone call between Italian Prime Minister Giuseppe Conte and Vladimir Putin at the end of March, 15 Russian military planes landed in Lombardy with doctors and technicians as well as trucks and equipment for disinfection. So the operation was called From Russia with Love, and there's nothing to add. Some newspapers speculated that the Russians were gathering intelligence, but as Alessandro Politti from the NATO Defense College wrote, it's unlikely because it takes years to set up an effective and secret intelligence networks. But it is a matter of fact that the Russians may have easily collected samples of coronavirus. At that time, Russia was not hit by COVID. According to my colleague in Moscow, the operation was developed primarily for, let's say, internal propaganda. But suddenly, two problems arose. The Russians were mainly involved into sanitizing retirement homes, which is quite a simple task. The Italian journalist Jacopo Jacoboni, and then we can come back to the slide, from La Stampa, wondered why not to engage Italian private companies instead of asking Russian army to do that. The journalist Jacopo Jacoboni from La Stampa was threatened with death by Major General, you see, Igor Konashenkov. Mr. Konashenkov is the Russian defense minister spokesman. And this general tweeted, "Who digs a pit for others falls himself into it." Second, on May 13, the newspaper Corriere della Sera reported that 150 Russian-made breathing machines given by Putin to hospitals in Lombardy were the same models that exploded in Russian hospitals, killing 6 people. So, after 5 days, that article, suddenly the Russians went back home, overnight. With a little explanation, our mission, they said, is over. Next slide, please. On March 29, the Prime Minister of Albania, you see, Mr. Edi Rama, made a speech that impressed very much Italian public opinion. Standing, you see, on the tarmac of Tirana airport, surrounded by 10 doctors and 20 nurses, all white dressed, as you can see, with their masks, Mr. Rama said, "We are among the smallest country in Europe, but we do not forget friends who helped us in the past." Today, he said, "We are all Italian. We are all Italian." That's why we will send and pay for a medical team in Italy for 1 month. This speech impressed the media because it was a kind of, let's say, a war declaration, moreover in a perfect Italian, against coronavirus. Mr. Rama used words like line of fire, deadly force, war, invisible enemy, bravery, and the message was crystal clear. The poor Albania is giving a lesson of friendship, while very rich countries, said Rama, have turned their backs on others. Next slide, please. On March 19, only 10 days after the beginning of the lockdown, this bigger plane landed in the airport of Verona, the city of Romeo and Julieta. It was a special plane sent by the evangelical relief organization Samaritan Purse, who set up an emergency field hospital in the city of Cremona with 32 doctors and nurses and high-tech equipment. Everything was so professional, so professional. They even had a media team that reported the activity on the ground with pictures, videos, and stories available on a website you can see at the bottom of the slide. Considering that Italian religious associations usually adopt a very low profile, Italians, I remember 71% Catholic and Pope-friendly, realized for the very first time how powerful are American evangelicals, whose doctors from time to time stop taking care and start praying together. You can see in picture number 4. The president of this association is a guy called Franklin Graham, by the way, a big supporter of Donald Trump, as you know very well. Last but not least, the aid from the communist country, China and Cuba. China provided millions of surgical masks and technical equipment since the very beginning of the lockdown. Aid from Beijing government as well as from private Chinese company had the same level in the payload, a sentence attributed to the ancient Roman philosopher Seneca. We are waves from the same sea, leaves from the same tree, flowers from the same garden. A small team of Chinese doctors also made a tour in Italy, Rome and Milan especially, to brief national Italian experts on how to face the COVID, according to their experience in Wuhan. Finally, on March the 19th, a team of 52 doctors and nurses coming from the Isle of Cuba landed in Lombardy, called from the local government. They worked 2 months in the city of Crema, close to Milano. The salary of the doctors, between $4,000 and $6,000 per month, was paid by the rich Regione Lombardia, ruled by the nationalist far-right Lega Nord party, to make it short, Matteo Salvini, famous for its rhetoric against communism. By the way, the salaries were paid directly to the communist Cuban government, and doctors and nurses, Italian newspapers reported, received only 30% of it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Frediano. There's some interesting examples there, the countries you mentioned, and I hope we can come back to talk about what other countries might have provided an assistance. I mean, quite an impressive combination: Russia, China, Albania, Cuba, and NGO from the United States. So we look forward to that in the Q&A. Now let's turn to Dr. Jamie Shea. Jamie, hopefully you're online and we're able to hear you and see you. Over to you, sir.
Well, it's great to see you again, sir, and you're looking healthy and well. I don't think the beard was quite as long the last time I saw you, but it's there. Thank you to you. Thanks to the NATO Defence College Foundation. Alessandro, if you're listening, or I'm sure you are, as always, thank you for involving me in the events. I can't be, unfortunately, there in Rome, but thank you for allowing me to intervene online. In my 7 minutes, what would I like to say about the impact of COVID-19? Well, when you get a major sort of global catastrophe, because in terms of the health, the number of people who have died, the number of people who have been infected, the economic hit, you probably can describe it as a catastrophe. What it does is, number one, reveals a lot about the state of the world as it already exists or existed. It shines a cruel light on many of the vulnerabilities that were always there but were not exposed. And secondly, of course, the impact of this sort of cataclysmic event drives the international agenda forward in new ways that we're going to have to deal with for generations to come. So what I'd like to do in my brief 7 minutes is talk about, number one, the cruel light on the existing vulnerabilities, and then secondly, a sense of where the COVID pandemic, once it does eventually subside and the vaccines are there, in my country, the UK, they've already been rolled out, where we will be left looking at the wreckage afterwards. Well, I think in the first place, COVID has sort of shown that we are vulnerable to shocks, and in a surprising way, not because we didn't know about them or not because we didn't have lots of potential analysis. For example, anybody who studies international relations will know that a couple of years ago, the learned journals were full of reports on the next pandemic, building on the early warnings that we'd had from things like SARS and MERS and avian bird flu and Ebola and so on. Many of our countries, my one, the United Kingdom, had conducted large exercises to prepare. The United States had even set up a special unit in the National Security Council to prepare for pandemic response. But as the initial warnings, like with SARS and avian bird flu, didn't produce the catastrophes that had been predicted, we sort of stepped back from those efforts and we allowed many of those preparations, the stockpiling and so on, to fade. France, for example, had the pandemic struck 20 years ago, would have been in a very good position to respond because it had domestic companies that produced respirators and medical equipment, testing kits, and also a large degree of domestic sourcing of the chemicals needed for medicines. But by the time that the pandemic came round, France was not even able to produce its own paracetamol any longer. It had allowed all of that industry to be taken into foreign ownership or to be effectively offshored. So in many respects, we are vulnerable to things that we've already sort of known about on our radar screen. But because they didn't happen when we thought they were going to happen, we demobilized. So the first thing is that, yes, despite all of the emphasis that NATO, the EU have put in recent times on resilience, we still have a number of vulnerabilities. We prepare for the scenarios that we expect, but not for the ones that are likely to hit us. So how we do a better job of sort of in the future of linking the sort of it could happen to the it can happen and to prepare, I think that's going to be a key thing. I mean, one thing that we know about COVID is it's shown just how easy it is for a new virus to spread from the animal world into the human world, particularly at a time when the two are increasingly mixed in to mutate, and therefore we know that this pandemic will not be the last. So rather like climate change, where events that once only took place every 100 years are now taking place every 10 years or even every year, there has been a sort of compression. We could say that just like, the last great pandemic was 100 years ago with the Spanish influenza, now we won't have to wait another century for a similar event. Pandemics will, like climate change and extreme weather events, occur every 10 years or every 1 year. So the first thing, of course, of this crisis is to learn the lessons so that we're better equipped next time round. Number two, COVID has shown a very cruel light on social inequalities. The poor, ethnic minorities, people who live in cramped conditions in multiple family units in inner cities have been far more exposed in terms of infections and deaths, the elderly in care homes, isolated, than the rest of the population. Unfortunately, it's the case that if you're more wealthy, you're less likely to have caught it and more likely to have been able to survive. So unfortunately, COVID does show exactly that when a pandemic like this comes around, people, for example, in the United States who lack health insurance and so on are more exposed, and therefore resilience in many respects is going to go along the way of reducing social inequalities and building up better healthcare and better welfare systems. Those countries with good, robust healthcare systems, and North Italy is the case, Germany is the case, many others, notwithstanding the shocks, have been much better able to deal with this than countries with very weak healthcare systems to which many people don't have access. Thirdly, COVID has had a greater impact on polarized societies. And unfortunately, the United States, which has been the country which has suffered the greatest number of infections as a country, and so far the greatest number of, is also a country with a high degree of political division and polarization. This makes it more difficult for the centre coordinate with the states in a decentralized system. Who is in charge? It makes it easier for fake news and disinformation, anti-vaccine campaigns and so on, anti-mask wearing campaigns, refusal to heed government advice. It makes it far easier for this disinformation to circulate. Countries in Asia with a high degree of social cohesion, a high degree of social discipline, have fared a lot better. Take Taiwan. We're a country of 24 million people, which is a democracy, but which has suffered only 9. Yes, I'm not joking, 9 deaths so far from COVID. So clearly, there is something about the way in which social models are conducted. A country like Germany, again, which is a decentralized nation with the Länder, but where the central government has had a much more effective working relationship with the provincial entities from the start. These countries have fared better. So there is something about polarization and political system which also plays into the resilient thing. The third degree is supply chain dependency. We've seen with COVID, the opposite side of globalization, where the dependence upon very lengthy supply chains, outsourcing, can be a vulnerability in a crisis. We've had to go to China. The previous speaker showed that with the images of Chinese PPE, protective clothing being delivered and so on, even for basic things, even for masks that we should be able to produce ourselves in Europe, but we haven't because of relative deindustrialization. And so, of course, one of the big issues that we're going to have to face as we go forward is to what degree do we repatriate or do we reshore those critical supply chains, or can we believe that, grosso modo, globalization worked? I mean, at the end of the day, we have been able to procure the supplies, even if often we've been competing with each other at the beginning or paying exorbitant prices. So to what degree do we continue to depend upon the just-in-time delivery of globalization, or repatriate for greater self-reliance, if not autarky, those supply chains as well? Political leadership, again, has been critical. Trust in political leadership, clear messaging, clear communications, public willingness to do what they are being told, even if they don't particularly like lockdowns or tier 1 or tier 2 systems, but the quality of political leadership has really mattered in this crisis, as it always does. But unfortunately, I would say that in terms of shining a cruel light on our existing state of affairs, COVID-19 has shown that the multilateral system in which we put so much faith and trust, particularly somebody like me, actually isn't quite as effective as it should be. We invoke multilateralism rightly because it corresponds to our notion of a liberal, rules-based international system. I support that wholeheartedly. But when a big crisis comes along, does that multilateral system really work? Take the UN Security Council. It took nearly 6 months from the outbreak of COVID-19 before the Security Council held its first meeting. It's been largely absent from the debate. The G20, which played such a massive role back in 2008 in managing the international financial crisis in the wake of the collapse of Lehman Brothers, has been, again, largely absent from the debate. The G7, not much. Let's be frank, the World Health Organization has been frustrated by the politicization of many of the debates, and of course the US withdrawal halfway through the COVID crisis. The WTO has, at least in terms of trade policy and relief, has been paralyzed by not even able to elect a new leader or appellate panels. And what we've seen which I think is going to be very interesting for the future, is a kind of new multilateralism. Asian countries, without the US and even without China, have formed their own coalitions and their own consortia. The EU has stepped in with COVAX, a system, of course, of being able to make sure that vaccines are donated to the developing countries who could be at the end of the queue. Bill and Melinda Gates have given far more to vaccine development, including $250 million today, announcement this morning by Bill and Melinda Gates, the many countries of the world. So we are seeing a new multilateralism emerging in the wake of COVID-19, based on smaller coalitions, coalitions of the willing, involving NGOs, private sector, countries who are willing to back an issue and work together, largely bypassing the more bureaucratized, immobilized existing institutions that we've known them as well. Also, science. One thing that COVID has done is revealed the absolute cruciality of science. You cannot get out of the crisis unless you innovate. You can't get out of the crisis with old vaccines, old medicine. You have to invent something new. And of course, one of the success stories of COVID has been the way in which new vaccines have been developed so quickly. This is a great triumph for science and great triumph for human ingenuity. But the lesson for all of us is that if we don't have an innovative R&D focused economy, if we don't invest sufficiently in R&D, in new technologies, if we cannot mobilize human talent fast in such a crisis, we are going to be dependent upon others, or we're going to be very much in the slow lane. And therefore, the crisis has shown, again, a cruel light, both in the United States and Europe, on scientific research, the life sciences, innovation, the ability to bring innovation to the market, and all of these kind of things. Now, very briefly, what are the new
elements? We're going to have some time for the Q&A to get into some of those issues, if that's all right. I think we have two more speakers.
Okay, if I'm out of time,
hang on for the Q&A
I'll
session.
stop there.
So, okay, thank you very much. We're going to keep moving now, and I think next up we have Andrew Spanos with us. So, Jamie, a lot of good points. I want to come back to those, but now let's offer the floor to Andrew. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Stephen. Thank you, the NATO Defense College Foundation, for having me here. And a greeting to Jamie Shea, whom I met 5 years ago in Brussels for a long interview, and a very interesting interview. I want to talk briefly about the transatlantic relationship, the effects it has on the strategic situation, and then get to the question of health at the end. First of all, there is a new strategic context, obviously. When we talk about NATO, we talk about transatlantic politics and cooperation. The situation is different now than it was 5 years ago, undoubtedly. The strain, I think, of the U.S.-Europe relationship during the Donald Trump years actually has provided a little bit of clarity. There were worries about the U.S. pulling out of the Middle East. There's worries about what is the actual policy towards Russia. These things have not been resolved yet. Some of them will depend on events, in particular the Middle East, on Iran, what happens with Iran. But it's pretty clear that the U.S. is reluctant to get involved, too much involved in the Middle East, and that the focus is going to be on China. You know, Russia is still seen as a bad actor, but the focus is going to be on China and the situation in which we live and in which the transatlantic relationship has to be considered is that of great power competition with China. Now, although this has been the direction for some time, it's important to stress this. This is the world we live in right now. Now, the Biden administration is working now, is beginning to calibrate its foreign policy. Which will certainly be more multilateral, but it will also build on the realism of the Trump administration. The situation's not going to go back to the way it was before, and this has implications, though, for a number of sectors. Now, how does this competition play out, and what kind of effects will it have? This touches on something that Ian Lesser said in his opening remarks. That is, the changes due to populism, how permanent they are or not. I think some of them are. There were massive changes, large changes underway already before the pandemic. And they've been heightened by the pandemic. They have been accelerated. But it's not the so-called populists who will be implementing these changes. Now it's up to the institutions, the more centrist and liberal institutions, to pick up the inheritance of what this populist period has left us. Things like trade policy, for example. A certain amount of decoupling reshoring of supply chains. We've lived in a period of decades where there's been a heavy focus on free market ideology, the power of finance to make international policy, and we've neglected, created a situation where we've actually weakened ourselves economically. So this will produce a reorganization a push for reorganization of supply chains in certain areas. Certainly health and the medical sector is one of these. It doesn't mean going back precisely to the past, that everything is going to come back and we're going to go back to the 1950s or 60s. We're in a new era, and we're in a digital era. And this has implications for the economy in a big way, for the effects on telecommunications networks, on technology, telecommunications technology, 5G and beyond, artificial intelligence, which has a great deal of importance for manufacturing and for infrastructure. So I think that the overall approach, it's not only possible but likely that we'll go in this direction of rebuilding a certain core economic strength which the West has lost, has been damaged in the West due to misguided policies. Now that brings us to health. Health is certainly, because of what happened this year, because of the pandemic, is at the center of this. We put up a slide here. We have a contingency plan for managing pandemics. Jamie Shea mentioned this, around the West, but in the military in particular, I want to give a few examples of how the military in the United States has been very focused on pandemics in recent years. This is General Martin Dempsey, the Chairman of Joint Chiefs of Staff, saying, this is, we're in a situation, this is from before, this is during Ebola, saying, look, we have these plans, and when a new situation comes up, we need to try to apply them, and apply them in the real world. If we look at the Worldwide Threat Assessment Report, prepared under the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the DNI in the U.S., every year, for a long time, this report has referred to the possibility for a pandemic outbreak, as a global event. And we're not just talking about something that they see as a small event, but a global event which can disrupt society. And we see plans, Pentagon planning, from, first of all, talking about a respiratory illness coming from animals to man, so very precise, but planning of how to deal with the lack of ventilators, how to deal with the lack of masks, what will the effects be on transportation, on the economy, on schooling. There have been large simulations, such as Crimson Contagion, not run by the military, but with the military participation, 15 government agencies, really mapping out what could happen in this situation. So we should have been ready. Why do I mention this? Because, well, we weren't quite ready. And this is a capacity in the military world which needs to be used. It needs to be exploited. And the question is, how can we do this in the context of international cooperation and transatlantic relations? The goal, in my view, is certainly not to militarize everything, say, well, we'll turn it over to the military and they'll take care of it. The question is, how can we use this capacity among countries? And this can be done with political leadership, but obviously NATO and security cooperation is an area that it can be, through which it can be vehicleized, as we would say in Italian, channeled, through which it can be channeled. It sounds nice to say we have to be transnational, multinational, multilateral, but the reality is that we're in this context of global great power competition, and countries have interests. And as we've seen in the crisis during the pandemic, it's not, well, let's all get together and decide what to do. Jamie Shea just mentioned this. Nations act, and they act at the beginning in their own interest. Military institutions have a great deal to offer for non-military areas. The question is, how can we use these institutions as a vehicle for coordination among policymakers in this context of an overall shift towards resilience and a new view of national security? I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you very much, Andrew. A lot to talk about. I'm glad you showed the General Dempsey slide. And when Jamie was talking about SARS and avian influenza and pandemic influenza, I actually wrote in my notes here Ebola, and the U.S. response and the worldwide response to Ebola maybe gave us a false sense of security. There were plans on the shelf. They were dusted off, as General Dempsey had mentioned. It had been rehearsed, and the timing of that and the outcome of the Ebola outbreak seemed perhaps to give a false sense of security, that we could deal with such a thing in a way and not let it get out of hand. But now let's turn to Daniela Riggio. Daniela, hopefully you're there online and able to join us from Brussels, from the NATO headquarters. Great to see you again, my friend. Over to you.
Thank you so much. First of all, let me run a very quick video and audio check. Can you see me and can you hear me?
And we can hear you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I know that time is of the essence here. First of all, many thanks to you, Stephen, for that kind introduction. Good to see you again. And my most sincere regards to Ambassador Minuto Rizzo, his valuable team, and last but not least, of course, the distinguished panelists and also the audience. Speaking about expectation management, well, to speak after Dr. Jamie Shea is a challenge in itself, so I'll try to play my part. First of all, I would like to start from a premise. I'm Italian, but I would like, for obvious reasons, to recall an op-ed penned by the Secretary General Stoltenberg on El Corriere della Sera, essentially highlighting the admiration for the resilience shown by the Italian population and the Italian authorities in dealing with the pandemic, from the health workers looking after their patients to the security and defense personnel. That op-ed also made clear that Italy did not stand alone. Italy, on the contrary, has received the medical personnel, ventilators and critical medical supplies from different allies, but Italy has also paid his part, if you wish, as a security contributor also in response to the pandemic by deploying, for instance, medical teams in support to Kosovo and Bosnia and Herzegovina, and as well as in making some of these assets available to the alliance. So I would have felt remiss if I had not started with a reference to my home country. I will be, as I said, very brief. First of all, I will provide a short overview of the NATO response to the pandemic. Then I will try to address the other aspect of the equation, how NATO has done its best to ensure not only that it reacted swiftly to the pandemic, but also in making sure, actually, that the health crisis could not turn into a security crisis. NATO simply did not have the luxury to shut down business as a result of the pandemic. And then I will conclude with a few remarks towards the future, particularly from the point of view of the NATO 2030 process. Now, from the point of view of the response to the pandemic, let me address a few critical points. First of all, the very critical role performed by the military forces. In the first half of the year, NATO allies flew more than 350 flights to support medical personnel, transported more than 1,000 tons of equipment, and helped build almost 100 field hospitals and over 25,000 treatment beds. The second point, the shared solidarity in words, but also with concrete actions. To cut a long story short, allied countries come to rescue each other, provided mutual support, and in this respect, a critical facilitating role has been played by our clearinghouse, the principal civil emergency response mechanism within NATO, which is the Euro-Atlantic Disaster Response and Coordination Center, which has been coordinated 22 requests for international assistance, which translated into more than 125 offers in support of the requests. Let me also make another point. Dr. Shea spoke about multilateralism and the challenges obviously associated to put that in practice. That being said, I think it's fair to say that NATO has been playing its part to coordinate its efforts as much as possible with other important international institutions, the European Union, the United Nations Office for Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, the World Health Organization, and the World Food Programme, all with the aim to make sure that our respective efforts could be as mutually supportive as possible. There is, however, another point that I would like to make with respect to the response given by the alliance in the first wave of the pandemic, and that has been the assistance provided to partner countries as well as to countries where NATO has deployed troops. In Afghanistan, for instance, our Resolute Support mission has helped to provide critical supplies to Afghan security forces in 14 provinces. In Iraq, in coordination with our NATO mission there, Spain has delivered essential medical equipment. And also additional help has been provided to the Iraqis by Turkey and Poland. And in Kosovo, our KFOR mission has donated personal protective equipment to hospitals in Pristina and Gračanica, and delivered more than 50 donations of food and clothing to 14 Kosovo municipalities. As you all are aware, NATO has also started to act in response to a second wave. It has approved an operational plan to deal with that, and it has also set up a pandemic trust fund, which includes a stockpile of critical supplies, some of which has already been made available to Western Balkan partner and allied countries. That's as far as my first part of the presentation is concerned. The second part, as I said at the beginning, is that the challenge for NATO has been twofold: how to be as reactive as possible to the pandemic itself, while at the same time ensuring that it could maintain operational readiness and it could continue to perform its core task of defending and protecting around 1 billion of its citizens. This means, in a nutshell, that the main themes in the NATO agenda have continued to be addressed. In Afghanistan, for instance, you may be aware of the recent statement issued by the North Atlantic Council reaffirming support to the peace process, particularly in light of the agreement of the new rules and procedures at the Doha talks. But the statement also makes one point, actually several points clear, but I think for reasons of time, I would just focus on two. First, the reaffirmation of the conditions-based approach of our engagement in Afghanistan, and secondly, our continued support to the Afghan security forces in performing their tasks. NATO continues to be present also in Iraq, and early next year discussion will continue on finalizing an expanded scope of our capacity building missions there. NATO continues its mission in Kosovo under the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1244 of 1999, providing a safe and secure environment and freedom of movement for all communities in Kosovo, and it's coupling that with the continued political support to the EU-sponsored dialogue between Pristina and Belgrade. Within the agenda, NATO has continued also to strengthen its partnership, particularly with the European Union. It maintains a dual-track policy vis-à-vis Russia, and I'm sure we can discuss this in more details during the questions and answers. So all this to say, the main themes of the agenda have continued to be addressed. Now, as we look ahead, I think an important takeaway is represented by the NATO 2030 process. You are aware of the report by the group of experts that was submitted to NATO allies literally a few days ago when the foreign ministers met in a virtual fashion. And as the Secretary General has said, this is one input of a broader process that will continue to feature consultations by the Secretary General with all allies and members of the civil society and the think tank communities, with three overarching objectives from the Secretary General's standpoint that continue to inform the 2030 process: keeping the military edge of the alliance, making sure that the alliance becomes an even more active forum of political consultation without shying away from the issues that exist among allies, and last but not least, by keeping a regional profile while developing further a global approach towards security challenges, because whether we like it or not, they all affect us all. Thank you so much. Over.
Great. Thank you very much, Daniele. I appreciate it. I'm glad you actually mentioned the EADRCC because it featured quite significantly in this pandemic. And so I'm sure we'll get to that in some questions when we talk about maybe organizational adaptations that the Alliance could do. So good news, we have plenty of time for questions, and we have some questions coming in already. So let me turn to the first one. Frediano Fanucci, for you. The first question has to do with COVID being a battle for influence across the countries. You, in your presentation, mentioned some rather specific countries. So maybe a two-part question. One is, well, what about some of the other countries? What did the European Union, members of the European Union, do for itself? We heard from Daniele now a little bit about some NATO countries. And secondly, how could national governments better prepare for a more coordinated media response? As a journalist, in fact, this has got quite a bit of flavor in this panel of journalists and public diplomacy with our speakers. So let's start with that. Frediano, over to you, please.
Okay, thank you. First question. Russia, China, and Albania were not the only countries who helped Italy during the first lockdown. There were other countries, other European countries, for example. There was an excellent airlift set up by Germany, by the German government, to connect Italian hospitals and German hospitals. Other countries, for example, the Dutch government sent a truck of medical equipment to Italy. But I think those aid there was a fragmentation. Okay, so for us, for journalists, it was quite more difficult to report about this aid because of this fragmentation. I selected 4 big stories, and TV, journalists, radio, they want big story to follow. Okay, once you report that an airplane from the U.S. Air Force landed in Aviano or Naples or what else, and just downloaded technical equipment or mask, that's over. Okay, journalists want big stories. That's the fact. Considering the coverage of the media response, this is a good question, but it is a question that should be addressed to Palazzo Chigi, to media advisor in Palazzo Chigi, not to me. I know that at the end of the lockdown, they made the press conference and they said which were the countries that the giving aids to Italy, but I think it was too late. It was too late. Maybe you should set up a team of people and to keep in touch with journalists. But again, I'm on the other side of the wall.
Well, maybe I could follow up with, it seemed to me that once being here for those 90 days of lockdown, the Sunday evening press conference where the next decree would be rolled out seemed to become a national sport and seemed to be managed fairly well by the government. Would you agree with that?
No, I agree with that, but you have to take into account that those press conferences were tragic, first of all, because the health authorities released the numbers of people of the death. So it was tragic, first of all. And second, Italians wanted to know if they were able to leave their home, if they were able to go into shops, to go to parks and to make jogging. So again, those press conferences were very useful, but I think they did too much. Too many, sorry. This is the problem.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Jamie, I think we have a question for you now, and it has to do with maybe the narrative. There's a lot of discussion about COVID-19 and the war on the pandemic. There was a lot of discussion about winning the war against the pandemic. And recently it seems like in many places that narrative changed to learning to live with the pandemic and how to not necessarily fight it as a war. So maybe could you comment a little bit on the narrative about the pandemic and fighting it as a war, and maybe even talk a little bit about things NATO could do to enter that debate in the narrative in terms of whether it's fighting a war or learning to live with COVID-19?
That's a very interesting question, Stephen. It certainly looks like fighting a war in terms of government spending. For example, in most countries, debt is the highest that it's been since World War II, and the amount of debt and government spending, deficit spending, in order to be able to pay people's salaries and so on, is, as I said, the equivalent of wartime. We have never known anything like this in peacetime. Secondly, wars tend to lead to the big state. The state takes control of more and more things in order to mobilize society, industry, the economy to deal with the threat, in this case a pandemic, and we've seen the big state re-emerging and likely to remain in place for some time to come. The degree of social discipline that's required, even if people are not, fortunately, being sent off to fight battles in foreign lands, but certainly in terms of deprivation, staying at home, well, it's not quite the wartime. We don't have rationing or anything like this, so let's not sort of get this out of proportion, but it does require a degree of trust between populations and government, so that governments are followed when they ask people to do things. And again, we've only really known that in wartime, where people, of course, don't follow the rules and continue to believe in the freedom agenda. You see the virus continue to spread. So there are certain analogies. I certainly would say, also building on what Daniele just said, that it's interesting to see that the military are now increasingly being used to deal with these kind of shocks. We've seen in Austria, the Navy lift people off beaches to deal with forest fires, or intervene elsewhere to deal with floods, extreme weather events, hurricanes, and so on. And now we see the military, not just in Italy, but throughout Europe, build hospitals, deal with, unfortunately, dead bodies, transport patients from one country to another where there is surplus capacity, pick up supplies and bring them back. And I think there is going to be an interesting debate as we go forward, how we use our military, as we already do, for example, in cyber defense or in anti-terrorism, to protect the homeland front, vis-a-vis how we use our military to deal with classical tasks like dealing with adversaries along borders abroad. So there are analogies, but at the same time, of course, we have to also recognize that unlike a war where eventually an adversary is defeated, hopefully then there is peace and we transform the political situation. When we're dealing with things like pandemics, yes, COVID is likely in one shape or another, like the flu, where we've never found an effective solution to be with us for some time. The vaccine gives us the possibility, like the flu or many other things, of being able to keep the thing under control. We don't have a cure for AIDS, but we do have drugs that that protect people from AIDS. So again, we come back, like in wartime, to the notion that the solution is in science, it's in research and development, it's in innovation. You can only solve the problem by going to the future. And I think that's a lesson that NATO and the EU will have to learn as well.
Thank you, sir. I'm glad you mentioned the science part of it, and I think let's turn a little bit to this idea of the vaccine, because now that we've seen the vaccines are being developed and a bit the race is on, well, the race was on, now we're starting to see some winners in the race. And just in the news, of course, recently there was a little spat over the Pfizer vaccine and differences in the speed with which it was delivered in the UK versus the United States. And I think I noticed today that Canada is now committed to the Pfizer vaccine. So a little bit of different perspective by nations on something like that. So Andrew, I'd like to turn to you and ask you a question about this this issue of the vaccine race. And since you talked about great power competition, do you see that this issue of vaccines for the virus is going to play some sort of role in competition, maybe not only great power competition, but in a transatlantic competition, as we just saw a little glimpse of with the UK and the United States? And how could a Biden administration play a role in this sort of competition or cooperation, if you will?
One thing, and a very important point about the United States in this crisis, that we saw at the beginning, we saw in Europe, I was in Italy during the lockdown. In Europe, you have, in most countries in Europe, you have a social state which is much more prepared to easily support your population when they don't work. First of all, more people have full-time jobs, although that's gone down over the years. So people just kept getting their salaries. And unemployment mechanisms were there. So your social safety net was stronger. But what happened in the United States is the United States for a certain amount of time, actually leaped forward. Public spending was huge. The United States government, the Congress, not the decree from the Prime Minister or the President, the Congress spent almost 15% of GDP this year, and increased unemployment benefits to a level that was higher than what many people earn if they work at Walmart or in an Amazon warehouse. So the United States really made a big push forward, and I do believe that although the Republicans, and some of them are pulling back, saying we can't have too much public debt, we've sort of opened a Pandora's box on public debt, to the point that many people from neoliberal economists, even if they're not right-wing, but in the center-left, such as we're seeing Larry Summers now, saying, well, public debt doesn't really matter. We have to change the way we think about it. Debt to GDP, which is part of the European Union treaties, it's being said by mainstream economists who in the past were very pro-liberal. They're now saying that shouldn't even be a measure of our economy. And so it's a new situation. At least it opens new opportunities. There'll be a fight, and the Biden administration has to decide how they want to go in this question. But to bring it back to vaccines, Operation Warp Speed was part of this. The United States government said, we're going to spend tons of money. Yes, we use the private sector, but we're going to guarantee the private sector money for the vaccines, and therefore they can move as quickly as possible to get it done, and they did get it done. So the advantage that China and Russia are looking for politically from having a public system and getting that done, I think is dampened a bit by the fact that in the West we've actually taken a big step forward on that. I would note on one thing you said, Frediano, about the Russians. When they were here talking about taking samples, that appears to have helped them, because they got their vaccine moving pretty quickly compared to others. And if it's true that most of the virus in the West came from Italy, as some people posit, well, that
we were exporters.
Then the Russians did spent their time in Italy well. Again, the Biden administration is certainly going to look for more multilateral cooperation, certainly in the World Health Organization compared to the Trump administration. But again, the question is, this question of what kind of society can deal with the virus. Asian societies are more regimented societies, have more trust in their public institutions, seem to have done better. Although that's sort of coming into question now, because Germany's not doing very, very well right now. Europe as a whole, despite locking down for a while, came back, and its numbers were worse than the United States in recent periods. So it looks like we really do need the science. We need to follow the rules. We need the science, but the governments really have to, decide how they're going to tackle this. And I think that there is a new opportunity for the West as a whole to sort of review some of the short-term thinking we've seen in the past.
Andrew, can I just follow up with one thing? Because you mentioned supply chains before, and it seems to me that here's a case of where there is already cooperation happening. The big pharma companies rely on each other. They use each other's distribution chains and things like that. I see in your background you have some economics in your background there. Is there a specific issue or angle that particularly on supply chains that maybe NATO and the transatlantic link should be looking at?
Well, I think this is a big issue. It's been a big issue well before the pandemic. I've done some presentations on this. If you go back and look, 2019 was the first year we've seen net reshoring to the United States. I don't think there's going to be total reshoring. There's some moving out of China or away from low-cost countries. And this is because of globalization in general. It's because of it starts with the social effects that we've seen, which led to populist outbreak in various countries. Now the pandemic accelerates that, and it means that we have to take a new view of what national security is. Part of this is medical. There's certainly no question about it that the interruption of supply chains in a country halfway around the world, for us, even if we can still use that phrase, was dramatic. It was dramatic since we were no longer producing things, which has been said. So I think that the notion of resilience and national security has to change now. And so when we talk about national security, we also talk about the military, and we talk about a mentality which is a little bit different, because a just-in-time market mentality of saving as much money as possible, cutting things out, for example, government preparedness, how much was cut because it wasn't really necessary. We have a false sense of security, it costs too much money, etc. The military is trained to think differently, think in a different way. You have to think for the emergency. So I do think that brings a sort of different mentality of national security, which can be applied to economics.
Great, thank you very much. Daniela, I'd like to turn to you. I'm glad you mentioned the NATO 2030 effort and the recent report by the Reflection Group. So I was just looking through that, and I noticed that there is a section on human security in that report. It's not health security directly, but it does talk about human security. And there's also some treatment of COVID-19 in that report and the pandemic response from NATO. I guess, I hate to put you on the spot, but in that report, what's your sense about the way that NATO is treating the pandemic in the context of the report? Did these experts see it as something significant that the alliance should address, or is it just another thing? In fact, I think the word that I read in there was that the pandemic was a distraction from NATO's primary mission of defense and deterrence of the Euro-Atlantic area. So any comments from your side on that?
Well, first of all, Stephen, the pandemic is a challenge in itself. It's such a global magnitude that it affected our lives, it affected our economies, and it affected our security as well. From a number of reasons, including from the point of view of risk of disinformation from entities that wanted to exploit that situation. So I would argue this was not a distraction, was a necessity for NATO too, actually, to play its part, because the pandemic hit also NATO allies. It's no coincidence that I started my presentation by talking about how particularly seriously Italy, as a NATO ally, was hit. The question, however, the real question, the real twofold question, has been from the outset, how can ensure that NATO plays its part, and how to ensure that at the same time this health crisis does not turn into a security crisis. If you wish, I think it has been a further demonstration of the need for NATO to maintain a 360-degree perception about security, and this explains both the efforts taken to deal with the pandemic, which, by the way, and I'm glad actually that previous speakers before talked about, including Dr. Shea, talked about the role of the scientific community. NATO, for instance, could tap on an extensive network of scientists through the NATO Science for Peace program in order to create the conditions for those imaginative solutions that were required for some cases. And Italy, in that respect, actually has played that part too. But as I was saying, there was a need to address the merit of the pandemic, but at the same time maintaining the core task of NATO, which is to defend and to protect the population. The reason why this has to be put into the broader issue of NATO's continued adaptation through the 2030 process is because the pandemic too, if you wish, has reinforced the merit of considering the security landscape as something that changes on a regular basis, and therefore NATO needs continuously to adapt. But let's make no mistake here. NATO has the challenge ultimately is for NATO to continue to adapt, while at the same time remaining a political military organization, a security provider, not pretending to become something which has never been and which will never be.
Thank you, Danielle. It resonates with me. I remember here at the college, early days in Italy, there was a discussion about whether we should close the college or not based on what was going on. And in one of our first consultations with the NATO headquarters, the leadership there said, "We are not closing NATO. NATO has to stay open during the pandemic. So even at the college, we said, okay, we can't close the college. We have to figure out a way to do it, and we did. So it was very much a matter of, the idea of we have to be able to do two things at one time. We have to be able to survive and endure the pandemic and be able to carry on with our mission, even though at the college, of course, not the same as maybe at the strategic commands. Okay, so we have some questions coming in. I'd like to turn to one specific one on military capability, which was mentioned a few times. So the question here is, it says, in countries like Spain, the role of armed forces was very significant in the fight against the coronavirus. Some significant lessons have been learned about the need to maintain robust military medical units ready to cooperate with national health services in a case of emergencies. Can you please comment on this topic? So maybe, Daniele, we'll start with you since you're at the headquarters, and then we can just go around the room.
Well, thank you so much, Stephen. Again, the military have a mindset, as Andrew before was eloquently pointing out, a mindset and the capabilities that are required to deal with challenges like this one. We all are aware of what implication defense expenditures are, including from a political standpoint, but I think the pandemic again proved that the military investing in military capabilities can save lives, can project a sense of security which is tangible, particularly in a situation of crisis. Let me add, and that's why during my presentation I mentioned Afghanistan, Iraq and Kosovo, that these allied military capabilities have also been critical for the sustainment of local forces that NATO allies security personnel deployed in various theaters train, advises and form. So that too actually has played into the more operational effectiveness of local forces that NATO is training. So in a nutshell, the military can play an important role, can make a difference in daily lives, and therefore investing in military capabilities pays off.
You think that maybe a slightly different angle, what would the reaction of the public be to seeing military medical units out on the street helping in this way versus civilian authorities? And in fact, in your example with the Russian case, it was why are we allowing the Russians to do this as opposed to contracting that out privately? Is there, maybe there's a cultural difference in some nations, but is there a concern about the military being out on the streets, in particular in this case medical units?
No, I don't think so, because the attitude of Italians towards military is a good attitude, despite we don't have a compulsory military service. I did it anyway in the 90s. No, I think the military, Italian army, Italian air forces, Italian navy had good images in Italy. But it's very interesting to point out what's happening in Italy now with the vaccine, with the distribution of the vaccine and the army, because the Italian government said that the army will be involved in the distribution of the vaccines. And the opposition party, the Northern League, Mr. Matteo Salvini, and if I'm not wrong also his ally Giorgia Meloni, are against them. Because they say that the Italian volunteering association should be involved instead of the military. So just to answer to your question, I would like to stress this news.
Excellent. Thank you. There's some questions maybe about the vaccine distribution. So if I can maybe read one here that says, NATO and the European Union are not always perfectly compliant with the policy for vaccine distribution. Additionally, country members are not the same. Do you think that it would be possible for NATO to be called in support of vaccine distribution, also in consideration of Brexit situation, the end date 31 December? So, Jamie, maybe offer that one to you first.
Yeah, exactly. But if I could, taking advantage of being able to come back into the debate on the previous question, we have become used to seeing the military on our streets, Stephen, as you know, since the terror attacks in Belgium, where I live, in France. The military for years were out on patrol, securing airports and railway stations. They've become, as I've said, much more focused on homeland security tasks. I spoke about extreme weather events. We've seen them out dealing with floods that are happening more frequently, with forest fires and so on. And I think one of the lessons for NATO is to build more on a concept of resilience when it looks at the new strategic concept, and to make sure that the military have all of those links with the police, with the fire brigades, with the border guards, with the emergency rescue services. I mean, we spoke about the comprehensive approach in NATO a few years ago. Daniele remembers this well, in places like the Balkans and Afghanistan, where the military on mission in foreign countries would link up with civilian actors and all work together. But I think this comprehensive approach is going to apply in the future within NATO countries as well. I mentioned dealing with cyber attacks, for instance, where the military, with their assets, with their intelligence, often work together with the private sector to deal with big cyber attacks as well. So I don't think that COVID-19 is going to be a kind of one-off for NATO in terms of using the military at home. I think this is going to happen more often. You mentioned the case of Spain. And I was talking the other day to Elena Gomez de Castro, who's the Director General for Security Policy in the Spanish MOD. And she was telling me how they've used a lot of their military technologies, which were designed for the battlefield, like robots, to help with virus detection and decontamination within Spanish. So some of those military technologies can have dual use as well, and I think that's worth looking at. Finally, just very briefly on this, and then I'll try to turn to your question. I think also you've got to remember that in the 19th century, if you sent a European soldier to a battle, like in the Crimean War, he was 3 times more likely to die of disease than of a battle wound by a bullet. Yellow fever, typhus wiped out generations of European soldiers. And what we've learned from COVID, is that our armies can once again be vulnerable to a pandemic, to a disease, or to even chemical weapons, which unfortunately have not gone away. So I think one thing that NATO needs to look at also is the way in which we protect our forces against man-made or natural diseases in future, so that they can remain effective in the battlefield. I'm not saying the 19th century is going to come back, but it's a potential threat to the future. Adversaries looking at COVID-19 will have learned the lessons to just how vulnerable military organizations are to these kind of pathogens and viruses. So we need to be prepared scientifically in that area as well.
Great. Thank you very much. Daniela, did you want to jump in?
Yes, thank you, Stephen. I just would like to build on a point made by Jamie, because before I re-stressed the importance for NATO to maintain its operational readiness. But Jamie, with his eloquence, also made me also remember the need actually to make another point absolutely clear, meaning that NATO's military posture had to be adjusted here and there, precisely to mitigate as much as possible the risk of vulnerability to our soldiers that Jamie was mentioning. And at the end of the day, NATO had also to make sure that another important challenge be met, and that is the very well-being and health of our deployed personnel.
Thank you very much. Andrew, any comments on this one?
Yeah, on the question of the attitude of the public on the military, I think you're American, and you know that this is a bit different in the U.S. than in Europe. I remember September 11th, 2001. Seeing soldiers at the airport, soldiers on the street, Humvees on the street, that's not normal in the United States. We're not used to that, and that gets some people worried. And we've seen this year that there are groups of society that react with at least outwardly a show of potential violence. They've gone gone to the Michigan State House with guns, react against restrictions on their liberty, on their freedom. Now, some of these people may be acting foolishly in the sense that asking them to wear a mask is not really a restriction of their fundamental liberty. I wouldn't equate that with totalitarianism, but some people do, and they get worried. And therefore, there is a delicate aspect of using the military in the United States. Now, bringing the hospital ship to New York, there was a big show made of that, important, excellent, and almost no one ended up on the ship, by the way, ended up not being used. But there are many ways that the military can be involved that is not so outwardly visible in the United States. We've heard various examples of capabilities, technologies, which have been used elsewhere, and I talked before about planning. So there are a lot of things that the military can do under civilian coordination in the situation of pandemic. I would also recall things which are military instruments, although not necessarily directly military, but which have names like the Defense Production Act. This is something that comes from wartime, which means that the United States president can force companies to produce things. In this case, Trump did it a little bit. To produce ventilators, right? They come from wartime, and people don't mind this idea of the mobilization, but there is a fundamental question of how to coordinate these resources, which I think are essential and provide a very important contribution, but how to do that within an effective civilian response, which unfortunately we've seen has not been as effective as it needs to be.
Great. Thank you very much. Just a reminder, you can post your questions online through the site, through the link. And we have a couple more here. We're actually back on the vaccines issue. And if maybe I could draw a linkage again to the group of experts report as part of that NATO 2030 process. There was also a section in that report that had to do with partnerships. And it talked about NATO's partnerships in various ways. And one of the items had to do with NATO's partnerships are primarily regionally based, and it's suggesting thematic-based partnerships. So maybe as an introduction to this question that's coming about, how might those countries, as I think Jamie Shea was talking about, those countries that aren't able to develop their own vaccine, they're not able to access, maybe they don't have knowledge economies. One of the discussions we've had is, we're lucky to be able to telework. Telework is a luxury. There's a lot of people in economies that aren't able to telework. So in these countries that are disadvantaged, developing countries, let's say, that don't have access to vaccines, is there a role for NATO and the NATO nations in helping those partners? Is there some sort of new partnership that could be developed thematically around health security, as the theme of this panel is? So that's the general nature of the question. New partnerships on health security with partners. And maybe we'll start with Daniele, if you're out there and you would like to take a try at that one.
Well, from a thematic-based perspective, yes, there is already a partnership developed, as I said before, with a variety of NATO partners through the NATO Science for Peace and Security program that has also if you wish, a health sector. So that is certainly a platform that continues to be used and which can be, if you wish, further strengthened. We have seen also partnership with the European Union in the fight against the pandemic, and that too actually could lead for more opportunities for cooperation. Whether this turns into an additional exchange of views on how we can further improve the comprehensive approach that Jamie mentioned before remains to be seen. But that is certainly something that could be considered. When we talk about NATO partnerships, however, I think we always have to be clear on the characterization of NATO partnerships, in the sense that the NATO partnerships partnerships are not supply driven, they are demand driven. So partner X or Y makes a sovereign decision actually to define areas of cooperation with NATO that best serve the interest and needs of that specific partner. So a lot depends also on the requirements of the individual partners themselves. Over.
Thanks, Daniela. Jamie, any quick comments on this one?
Well, I think when it comes to the vaccines, of course, there's a system in place, COVAX, which has been developed by the European Union. Many countries and NGOs have signed up to it. And basically, it provides that for those countries which buy too much of the vaccine, probably they don't see it that way now. They can't get enough of it, but there will come a time when the rich countries that have sort of concluded contracts, with 25 different pharmaceutical companies, hoping that at least one of those vaccines will work, and have guaranteed at the moment, Stephen won't believe this, but it's true, about 95% of the market, leaving only about 5% left for the developing countries. So COVAX works on the assumption that the countries which have excess vaccines sometime next year will be willing to give those excess vaccines more or less free to the developing countries. And there's organizations like Gavi, there's the World Health Organization. So I don't honestly believe that NATO needs to get involved in that. But what I think we do need, we haven't discussed this yet, we do need to face is the COVID has cascading effects in other areas. For example, for the first time in a decade, sub-Saharan Africa is going backwards in terms of living standards, in terms of GDP, rising debt. The World Food Programme has calculated that now there are 250 million people, largely in Africa, but elsewhere, Southwest Asia, who are now living on the brink of a large famine, because COVID has led to less demand for African commodities, all of these things. So we may go, Daniele mentioned quite rightly, not to go from a health crisis to a security crisis, but we could definitely go from a health crisis to a basic food sustainability crisis. And we've seen in the past, NATO, for example, assist the World Food Programme, believe it or not, when it came to delivering supplies to Somalia, using its transport lift for those kind of humanitarian things. So to answer your question, you're looking down the road as the health crisis turns into a much greater economic crisis and a great regression. The funny thing is, before COVID arrived, in terms of development and the Sustainable Development Goals, we were actually making progress towards reducing poverty levels in the world. And now, unfortunately, because of COVID, we're now going backwards. And so I could see NATO more dealing with those kind of implications, lifting supplies in to famine areas, that kind of stuff, maybe more than distributing vaccines, where I think the channels are already very well established.
Thank you. That's a great observation. When it comes to the United Nations, I think NATO has a two-person team at the headquarters, liaison team at the headquarters, but it found itself recently trying to put liaisons in the World Food Programme and the World Health Organization and not really knowing what to do, having to create relationships from scratch in times of crisis rather than already having some relationships built. So that's a great observation. Exactly, I guess, the kind of potential partnerships that could be in mind.
Can I make a question?
Absolutely.
I'm a panelist, but I would like to make a question to Daniele Riggio or Jamie Shea. While we are speaking in Brussels, there is a European Union meeting ongoing, and we know that some member states are upset because the Hungarian Prime Minister, Viktor Orban, wants to use the Russian vaccine even if it doesn't have a green light from the European authority. So my question, I have two questions. The first question is there a problem from a NATO point of view if a member relies on vaccines made in Russia? And the second question is, do you have evidence that Turkey is going to ask Russians vaccines?
Daniele.
Yes, thank you. Before I address the question from Frediano, let me just build on a point made by Jamie. that in response to the pandemic, NATO did receive a request for airlift support from the United Nations, and therefore this past July, flights coordinated by our Disaster Response Coordination Centre and operated by the UK Royal Air Force transported a field hospital to Accra, the capital of Ghana. So that lift support that Jamie was mentioning is still pretty much on our agenda as it was the case that I just explained. On Frediano's question, well, I mean, they're pretty much hypothetical questions, to be honest, in the sense that I'm not aware that either of the two specific issues have been tabled for discussion amongst allies, and therefore I cannot share further details in that respect. What I think it's clear also from the Allies' perspective is that, of course, a vaccine, whatever that is, has been checked with respect to all the international recognized medical requirements. So this is as much as I can go with respect to the points raised by Frediano.
Very good. We only have 5 minutes left, so what I propose to do is just do one last round of one question and then an answer from each of you. And this is a professor's favorite kind of question, but if you had 1 minute with the Secretary General and we're going to give him advice on human security issues or health security issues in the context of what we've been talking about for the last hour, what would it be? So let me start here in the room with you, Frediano, if I can put you on the spot.
You mean the actual Secretary General?
The Secretary General of NATO, yeah.
Andrew, please. I'm thinking about. I'll get you back.
Andrew.
Well, I would come to this idea of NATO's capacity of exploiting this moment to use military capacity to address certain problems, not just from a physical standpoint. We've heard of various examples of how that can be done, but I think obviously this is the political side of it, and NATO is political, but this obviously goes well beyond the military alliance. But it picks up a bit on what was said before. What's our view of what we're doing for other areas of the world, partnerships for other areas of the world. If we're going backwards, as Jamie Shea said, in certain areas, well, isn't it time now to use this mentality, which I was mentioning before, of preparation, organization, efficiency, investment, which looks at things from an emergency standpoint, a crisis standpoint, which is a whole lot better than what we've seen from the market fundamentalist view over the past decades, which put us in a situation where we were not prepared. So the military has a role to play here, and I think that my suggestion would be, let's find a way to play this role and use it on a political level.
Great, thank you. You ready, Frediano?
Yes, the question is, coming back to Trump worries, can the expenses for vaccines can be considered also military expenses?
Part of the 2%.
Part of the 2%.
Okay, that's a great question. Jamie Shea, how about you, sir?
Has accelerated what was going to happen anyway, which is, of course, the future of technology, where we're going to increasingly be working virtually dependent upon our information technology systems, and increasingly dependent upon the flow of data, because it's that flow of data which has allowed the scientists very quickly to work together across barriers and borders and come up with the vaccine. So my suggestion to the Secretary General was to turn NATO much more into a a democratic technology alliance where we're going to be working across the Atlantic in a way we haven't done over the last 4 years, where we've had differences about, taxation of tech companies, data privacy rules, whether the European Union is allowed to transfer data to the United States in the first place. That's held us back. What NATO needs to do, particularly with the Chinese challenge coming out of COVID-19, is look at its own technological sovereignty in artificial intelligence, in 5G, in cloud, quantum computing, space-based data processing, and all of those kind of things, because that's where the 21st century power is going to be decided, not on any conventional battlefield, in my opinion. And NATO has to stay at the cutting edge of a lead in technology and science and research and development if we're going to be able to have that autonomy, and if we're going to be able to deal with all of the various resilience challenges that are coming our way. So NATO needs to be much more of a science and technology organization. Daniele has rightfully mentioned the science program. We've got a great start, but we need to raise this much more up to the ambassadorial ministerial level. But, NATO's already looking at disruptive technologies, so it's making a good start, but it needs to be much more the focal point for the technological resilience of the global democracies in the 21st century, at a time when the authoritarians are learning how to do technology, in some cases, better than us.
Thank you, Jamie. Daniele, last word, 30 seconds.
Yes, I'll try to be very brief. Well, first of all, Frediano mentioned, the definition of the defense expenditures. Not up to me, obviously, to second guess the intentions of our heads of state of government, but it's an extremely pertinent question. Let's, however, make as a first point the fact that there is already a defense investment pledge at the Wales summit of 2014. Let's make sure that we continue to work on that. So far, 10 countries have reached the 2% threshold. But I think overall, the most encouraging trend is that cuts to defense expenditures have stopped, and this is actually the 6th consecutive year of increased expenditures. And in this, we have also noticed, and going back to the point made by Jamie, more investment on modern capabilities and research and development by individual NATO allies. Second point, NATO ministers actually have approved the enhancement of what we call the guidelines of basic resilience requirements for societies, because at the end of the day, an effective security and resilient societies are two sides of the same coin. My third point is simply to reinforce the point made by Jamie. I could not agree more. I would just add one item to the pretty comprehensive list that he put together, and that is underwater cables, which the protection of which represents another key security requirement for us. And by the way, it's one of the informing principles of the new Atlantic Command set up by NATO. Over.
Thank you very much, Daniela, and thank you, everyone. Quite a range of topics. We talked about the challenge presented by COVID-19, the successes of NATO in responding and simultaneously performing its mission. We talked about technology and partnerships, about competition and specifically collaboration. And it's been a great collaboration here with our panelists today. So I'd ask everyone to join me virtually in a round of applause. Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to shift now to a special intervention by Ambassador Francesco Tallo. Ambassador Tallo is Italy's permanent representative to NATO. Had the good fortune of meeting Ambassador last year before he was assuming duties, and then again at our academic advisory board in Brussels last year for the college. He's previously been the coordination for cybersecurity at the Italian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He's been the ambassador of Italy to the State of Israel. He's coordinated an OSCE conference against anti-Semitism. He's been a special envoy of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to Afghanistan and Pakistan, and the Consul General in New York. So it's a great pleasure for me to introduce this evening, or this afternoon, wherever you are, Ambassador Tallo. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and it's a great pleasure to be with you at this late time. It's somehow almost happy hour, so I hope that it's going to be really happy for all of us, and also for people who are following us at home while I'm speaking from there, from the NATO headquarters in Brussels. And indeed, we are dealing with the key issues of this time. Which, as Ambassador Minuto Rizzo said, are special times in a liquid world in the age of uncertainties. So how to deal with something which is uncertain? We need really to look to the future, to imagine, to forecast the future. And it's not easy. The easiest thing to say is that we should expect the unexpected. It's somehow a catchphrase, something quite obvious. But we are prepared. We are prepared. And in fact, in the first panel, I heard Roberto Menotti saying, was asking whether NATO has the conceptual capacity to deal with unprecedented challenges. Well, I should say yes, definitely. And we have the proof just recently with the report of the so-called Group of Reflection, a group of experts which has been nominated by the Secretary General of NATO, and they really focused on the key issues that we are dealing with today and tomorrow. So all these issues, pandemics, climate change, disruptive technologies, they are all really crucial in this report. And actually, there is another thing which is somehow more structural at NATO headquarters, which struck me when I arrived here. It's the existence of a division which is called Emerging Security Challenges. I think this is really meaningful. I don't think that many organizations have divisions, have structures with such telling and somehow visionary names. They invite us to look what is emerging, but also, I think, what is underwater. I'm not a technological guy, but I understand that we should at least imagine, if not really understand, what is the large part of the iceberg, what is underwater, what is not emerging. And here, certainly, we have many phenomena which one cannot imagine, one cannot expect. But if you think twice, then you understand that one should have expected. Many say that this is the case of pandemics. One should have expected something like this. So probably it was not the black swan. Probably it was what they called the gray rhino. The gray rhino, and now I enter somehow in the zoology I am proposing for this evening. The gray rhino is a highly probable, high impact, yet neglected event. So gray rhinos are not random surprises, but they occur after a series of warning signs and visible evidence. Well, this is definitely the case of disruptive technologies, of climate change, and in future it should be the case of pandemics. I mean, we have a justification for the first time, but at the second time you don't have any justification. So we have to be prepared, we have to deal with these aspects which are going to be permanent, structural in our life, and they all have a strong impact on our security. Just as have been said, for instance, on pandemic, I mean, at the beginning, to be honest, we were all caught by surprise. All organizations, all countries. We cannot pretend that we have been perfect. In this sense, I think that Ursula von der Leyen has been very honest, and in Italy we admire her for the excuses she said to Italy, for the fact that openly she said at the European Union we made mistakes. But then there was a capacity to react in the European Union and at NATO. And it has been said, and this is very important, that we avoided the risk of transforming a safety crisis, a health crisis, into a security crisis. And here comes another crucial word and concept: resilience. Resilience probably is the trendiest of trends. Next year will be really, I think, a main topic for all of our activities. And this is something really important because it's not only something which has to do with foreign policy or military things. This is really an encompassing concept which has much to do with our home front, which is the first line of fighting issues like this. But then all of these issues have much to do with the opportunities. And somehow we have to replace the black swan fatalism with a grey rhino constructive pragmatism. And I think that, again, NATO's history is quite interesting in this, because we have a continuity aspect, which is the link to our values, which is the fact that we are the longest existing alliance in history, since 71 years. And so it means that values are the same, they are strong, and they make this alliance unbreakable. On the other hand, the alliance is unbreakable because it has the capacity to adapt to new challenges and to absorb new the reality of the development of technologies. And I think that this is very clearly demonstrated by the increase of the military domains. Well, we started somehow maybe 10,000 years ago, fighting each other on the fields, on the ground. So there was one dimension in conflicts, was the ground dimension. Then somehow maybe 2,000 years ago, a little bit more, at the time of the wars of the Romans against the Punics, the Carthago, the maritime dimension was added. And we lived for 2,000 years with only two dimensions. 100 years ago, so note the tempos, the rhythm of changements, we had the new dimension of the air power. And then in just a few years, we have had two new dimensions. In 16, cyber, in 2016, and last year, 1 year ago, at the London summit, the new dimension of space. These two new dimensions have something in common. They are somehow extraterritorial. So you cannot apply them to a precise territory. You cannot say that there is a cyber operation over the territory of a certain country, because you don't know where the attack is coming from. And the same is for the extra-atmospheric space. I mean, a satellite goes around the Earth everywhere in a few minutes. So this means that they are really disruptive. They are horizontal because they have to do with all the other dimensions. And we are entering somehow in a completely new era also for our mindset, for our way of thinking. And this is especially true when we think about artificial intelligence and all the consequences of it. And in this sense, we are facing somehow a Sputnik moment. The challenge is probably also how to exploit this moment. I mean, Andy Spanos was mentioning this, referring to another aspect to pandemics and dealing with third countries, with other countries. But in any case, we can exploit this Sputnik moment. And we have to understand how much this Sputnik moment is different to the one which 60 years ago, about 60 years ago, was the one challenging the United States when the Russians, when the Soviets sent their first vehicle in space with the Sputnik. Well, at that time, the Americans were so strong that in a few years they have been able to face the challenge and to overcome again the Russians, the Soviets, and to be the first to arrive to send a man on the moon surface. Yes, other European countries had limited capacity starting in the 60s, including Italy, but the US was more than capable to work alone. Now this is no more possible. Now no country of the West, as strong as it can be, can face the current challenges alone. The European Union, even if it's capable to unite, and we all hope that it is capable to unite with strong projects and having a stronger capacity and investing a lot of money and resources and good political will, it will never be able to face the challenges alone. And the same is for America. So we have to really hope. Europe needs to hope for a strong, for the USA to be strong, just as much as the USA need to hope for a stronger Europe. We have to work together, and we are stronger together to face all these challenges. Certainly, the disruptive technologies, which require a lot of money to invest, and a lot of data, which is another very important resource, which we need to put together, and where we are limited because, for instance, of the limitations we have decided to respect the privacy of our citizens. For instance, with the GDPR, with the regulation, with the European regulations, which is very important. And our challenges don't have this kind of regulations. There is a country with 1.4 billion people, China, which has no kind of regulations to respect the privacy of its citizens. So we have to work together to put our data together, respecting our citizens, to invest much more together to deal with the disruptive technologies. The same is obvious for climate change. And with climate change, really, we need to cooperate all together. It's not a question of democracies or not democracies. And that's why it's a challenge for the United Nations, for the big alliances which are united with the Paris Agreement. And then it's the same for pandemics. Pandemics also has no borders, and we have to work all together when it's a matter of health. But certainly there are aspects where we have to work in let's say, a like-minded framework. And I like the appeal of Jamie Shea to have a technological resilience of democracies, I would say of Euro-Atlantic democracies. This is really crucial, working together and having resilience together. Also because we have to face somehow all these rhinos coming together and having and being interlinked and getting stronger because of their cumulative effect. I learned today that when you have a group of rhinos, and it's called a crush of gray rhinos, and it's not herd, this is the zoological term for the group. We have to overcome this challenge of the rhinos, and we have to get out stronger and to see what is coming. They are in front of us, the gray rhinos. They are not hidden. They are not like a black swan. We have, therefore, a special responsibility. We have more responsibility because we see them and we can do something, and we have to do something together as an alliance, as like-minded countries, countries which share the same values. And together we will be stronger because we have been able to overcome these challenges. And this is the history that somehow of the last 500 years. I think that this is an history which is particularly linked to Italy, because I said 500 years to make reference to the Italian Renaissance, which was somehow a turning point, because it was the moment when the West started to have the technological edge, which was translated into a cultural age, or the cultural age was translated into a technological one. I mean, the two, of course, are two faces of the same medal. And this, of course, was also the start of a political edge. One can, of course, see all the negative aspects. Colonialism is one of them, but certainly this is also connected with the affirmation of our values which have changed and evolved during the time. And it's important to think to our values when we consider this kind of challenges. This is particularly true when we speak about artificial intelligence, of course, because ethical questions are crucial in this sense. And that's why it's important that we deal with these aspects in a Western perspective, a perspective which puts human rights, today is Human Rights Day, which puts human rights at the center. And human rights are at the very center of our alliance, in its preamble. So all this is really crucial. And then, of course, I spoke a little bit less about climate change, but we really hope that next year will be a turning point for climate change. Italy, together with the United Kingdom, is going to host COP26, and we really think that the nexus between security, our security, and climate change is evident. I mean, we had some interesting considerations at the previous panel, and we see how much, both from the high north and from the south, already now, the climate change is having great implications which could have also consequences for our security. We are proposing this issue at NATO since already 1 year or more, and last September, together with our British colleagues, we organized for the first time a seminar dedicated to the challenges of climate change and environment at large for our security. And we did it also, of course, involving the European Union as well as the African Union, because I think it's very important to work with these partners. And I mean, Africa was already mentioned in this framework. And here we have a double phase challenge and work to do. On one hand, we have to deal with the possible new risks, threats, which are consequences of the climate change. And they can come both from south and north. From the north, they could be related, for instance, to the possibility to use maritime routes from the Arctic Sea, so the northeast, the northwest route, and therefore we could be threatened much more also from the north and not only from east or the immediate south. On the other hand, it's clear that climate change in the south is, for instance, a cause of desertification, and we know how much desertification is linked to migrations, and migrations could be linked with instability, and instability is a cause, of course, of threats to security. So everything is linked. We have huge challenges. We see the challenges. We must deal with them. We have a special responsibility. But I think that we can overcome it. And somehow, I mean, today the issue, the nice title of this conference today and tomorrow is about game changers. So clearly, COVID has been the game changer of the year, but actually, all gray rhinos have been game changers. So also disruptive technologies, artificial intelligence, and climate change are game changers. But what I would like to propose to conclude is that the best perspective for us is not to be passive victims run over by rhinos, but to become the real game changers of our age. So the game changers are ourselves. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Ambassador. I think we are come at the end of our day. It has been a long day in terms of substance, in terms of the issues that have been discussed. We had, I think, an impressive number of interventions and so many concepts that we have to take care of and to take stock of. We had a different kind of event, I think, today, because we tried not to have the usual, I want to be frank with everybody, the usual webinar, but to try to have a rich event where there is also some entertainment, where people come in, images, perhaps also some kind of movie. I hope you have enjoyed that. We try our best to make the event interesting in all senses. We had the first panel that was about an important issues, climate change. The second is about the nexus on security and health. But I wish to thank you very much for all your attention. I thank you for having been connected with us, so many. We had a large number of people, an impressive number of people who have been connected with us today for this event, much more than we thought in advance, and I thank everybody for that. Stay connected, stay tuned, have a good evening. Tomorrow at 3 o'clock we'll be back with something perhaps even more interesting. We are going to talk about artificial intelligence. Good night to everybody.